and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob, and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today, we're jumping into some ProRevenge and nuclear revenge. Before we start, if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and you can always change your mind later. But if you stick around, there just might be a big plate of cookies in your near future. Alright, our first story today comes to us from Sun Cardinal. Help my roommate rob us and make us homeless? Bye-bye, army officer job. Let's jump right in. After my son was born and my wife almost died from pulmonary embolisms due to undiagnosed lupus eating her lungs, we finally managed to go on our first family vacation when my wife's health recovered. To preface this, we had to get a roommate to help with bills during this time, and a longtime friend was happy to help out and get a reasonable place to stay. Now, this is where Army Liar comes in. I had known this guy for almost 2 decades, spent entire summers at his family's place, and even lived with him on multiple occasions. I genuinely thought of this guy as my brother, cried in each other's arms type of crap. But as dumb people do, he developed a massive ego after his parents paid his way through Colorado State University Pueblo. He started hanging with the definition of giga-chads, and all of a sudden is nothing but conservative politics and lying his butt off to get into the reserve officers training program for the Army at the college. This is important for later. Working out at the college with his bros, and generally being above hanging with people who couldn't have a golden parachute from their parents. So Army Liar graduates, gets commissioned as an officer, and it's a shock when he wants to come hiking and partake of adventurous, generally wild college youth stuff. My roommate gets together with him, and through the wonders of the World Wide Web, we had a great time. I managed to decompress from my almost dying wife, as well as the struggles of being a new father. Now, back to vacation, we visit family in Oklahoma. I had not seen my family in ages, and it's a great time. When we arrive back home, half the whole house is empty. There's a note from the roommate that Army Liar helped him move all his crap out, and good luck. Understandably, this was a terrible turn of events. Any parent will tell you, you can't just plop some rando in the now vacant room due to trust concerns and an infant present. Now I'm frantic at this point. Tons of our crap is missing. Our marriage documents, birth certificates, lease, wife's 3DS, and more all gone. I start blowing the roommate up and Army Liar calls me. He proceeds to tell me he orchestrated it all because roommate was not really happy here and needed to move back to Central BFE, Texas from Colorado. I know, it's silly. I am obviously upset, but Army Liar was my chosen brother. Literally take a bullet for him. I explain that I am missing all the things I've noticed. This MF has the nerve to say, yeah, not my problem. I was floored. He had spread some BS about me treating my roommate badly to his whole family, and they stopped talking to me. These are people who essentially raised me, housed me, and who were better parents than my own. I'll confess that I did something then that I was not proud of at the time. I told Army Liar that if he won't at least help me get my things back, I would have to contact his army supervisor and explain how he essentially just helped rob me. He laughed and told me to go right ahead. In the end, I caved and didn't do anything. I was too mentally and emotionally exhausted. My wife was crushed, and my son was upset by our constant crying and worrying about how we were going to pay our bills. Ultimately, we lost our place and were forced to attempt moving back with my parents, which was not a solution because my mom is a terrible human and had filled every available space with foster children to game the state for money. We lived out of our car until I found a temp job in Houston, which ended, and decided that they were done with the project I headed and terminated my position after telling me I would be moved to salary. Back to living in a car, this was the darkest time of my entire life thus far, and more than once I fantasized about driving my family off a bridge or into oncoming traffic just to escape this hell. I finally landed a stable job back in Colorado, was able to get counseling and rebuild our lives in a way that depended on nobody but myself. Happiness actually came back into our lives. My 2-year-old son would never remember this dark period, and I made friends who put Army Liar to shame. But what's this? I hear from some old friends that Army Liar dropped them like old garbage, and they missed him, wondering if I knew where to find him. and find him I did. Turns out B-Boy, Army Liar, got married and was traveling the globe as an Army officer, strongly exuding the whole 10 yards of my crap doesn't stink vibes. I remarked to one of my good new friends who just left the Navy that I couldn't believe they gave Army Liar a security clearance with all the things Army Liar had done in the past, which would disqualify such a clearance. My friend told me that Army Liar most likely lied and had his new bro friends do all his interviews because if the Army found out, they wouldn't have cleared him. Cue the gears to start turning. Turns out it's incredibly easy to get in contact with people who care in the Army. I talked through Army Liar's complete past, leaving nothing unsaid. I threw my own dignity to the wind and spilled every illicit detail of the shenanigans we were involved in as 18 to 23-year-olds, including the previously mentioned relaxing hiking trip, the one he took after his swearing in. Needless to say, guess who should pop up on my LinkedIn feed as transitioning out of the Army without a listed clearance? Now, Army Liar and his wife live at separate addresses, and I'm sure that has nothing to do with forwarding his past full of legally questionable deeds to her good Christian cell phone number, but we will never know. I now go look at his obviously depressed face on LinkedIn anytime I'm feeling down. Don't ever let people convince you to forgive and forget. Burn those bridges down. They deserve it, and I promise it will be the best feeling you have ever felt. I know it was for me. Now, a bunch of people in the comment section for this one were asking OP if they ever got their missing paperwork back, and OP responded to them and said, nope, never got anything returned. When I called the police, they said it was a civil matter, most likely a packing mistake, and since the roommate had already left to Texas, it would not be worth filing a report on. Alright, I don't know, but it sounds to me like they just might not have wanted to do their job in that case. OP was away from the house. OP comes back to the house and a bunch of their stuff is missing. That's very clearly theft. I don't think it's a mistake in packing if it's a whole bunch of different things gone missing, especially things that they knew that OP would miss. OP mentioned in another comment that he follows this person's Reddit account and that they'll probably see this story eventually. Not that it wouldn't be obvious who got him, since the interview with the special investigator he did was very in-depth. Our next story today comes to us from Kibu Fox, Revenge on the Movie Producer. Let's jump right in. Please allow me to note well in advance, this story is not mine. In fact, it's a rather popular story in a town I once lived in, Savannah, Georgia, and centers around one homeowner who got royally annoyed with a movie producer. There will be a note at the end about the fellow this story is about for those interested. Okay, so first and foremost, when movie producers are looking for places to set a movie that takes place in colonial or even 1800 cities in the US, due to the sheer number of parks, wide roads, and period houses, they will often select Savannah, Georgia. They'll pull all the Spanish moss out of the trees or trim it back, pour dirt on the roads around the squares, and effectively backdate that part of the city to fit most any place, even up to some having used the area as a setting for places like early Washington, D.C., and even places in Britain or France. Typically, when producers do this, they will pay each homeowner whose house is used as background flavor a couple $1,000s for the licensing to do so. That will be important later, trust me. They issue some rules like no electric lights being visible, not coming out of any door that faces the street, and you have to move your automobiles away from the drive if you have a drive. Well, 1979, a producer came from Hollywood with the intention of using Savannah for that very purpose. Specifically, the producer was from one of the big three-letter TV channels and was working on making a made-for-TV movie talking about the events after the assassination of Lincoln and the subsequent accusations of the doctor present at his death. The production went to the city to seek permission and then sent an announcement out to each of the homeowners telling them of the various days that the shoot was going to take place. However, much to their downfall, they also noted that the production company would not be compensating the homeowners for the use of their homes as backdrops. This was met with some great annoyance by the homeowners, who turned to the city for help, only to be told that it was their civic duty to allow the use of their homes. Most everyone agreed to this and bit their lips. One homeowner, however, didn't. he decided to get revenge on the production, attempting to screw up their shooting every chance he got. He first started by leaving his car out in front of his house, only to have it towed before filming started. He threatened legal action against the studio, but that fell on deaf ears. He forbade the use of his home in some of the shots, but the production company got the city to make him back down. Eventually, enough was enough. So he waited, biding his time, until he was certain they were filming. When the day came that his house was being used as a background shot, the homeowner grabbed a massive flag and hung it out in front of the house, out one of the top windows. The production company balked. They knew that this ruined any shot they'd used there. And what's more, they started to question just when he'd put the flag up. Was it just the one day? Or had all the previous shots, some which showed the house from across the square, been ruined as well? They turned to the city for help, and the city just basically shrugged, saying that it was his First Amendment right to do that, and implied that had the production company paid the homeowners, as had always been done before, then this probably wouldn't have happened. In the end, the production company had to end shooting and go to the homeowner begging for him to remove the offending flag. He did eventually do so, but only after his lawyer got a contract in writing that required the production company to pay all the homeowners for having their homes in the shot. The flag came down and shooting wrapped in less than a day. Interestingly, it's said that in the movie in question, The Ordeal of Dr. Mudd, there are several shots where you can see a bright red flag flying from one of the homes in the distance. That stunt cost a producer quite a substantial amount of money, and pushed production back at least a year while they tried to find every single instance that the flag flew in the background shots. This homeowner would go on himself to become very famous, though not for a good reason. Even so, he lives on among the legends of that city, both for his revenge against a movie producer and his later brush with fame. The fellow in question is none other than Jim Williams. Williams was an American antiques dealer and a historic preservationist based in Savannah, Georgia. He played an active role in the preservation of the Savannah Historic District for over 35 years. Williams was arrested on May 2, 1981 for the alleged murder of 21-year-old Danny Hansford, with whom he had been having a relationship, at Mercer House. After the subsequent 4 trials, a record in the state of Georgia, Williams was finally acquitted by a jury in Augusta in May 1989, 8 years after his arrest. Williams died in 1990 of heart failure, though AIDS is also suspected. He is the center of the story Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil novel, and later Clint Eastwood movie. One thing while reading this story really stuck out in my mind, and that's that they were able to tow his car even though it was parked in front of his own house. Like, what would be the legal precedent there for removing that vehicle? Well, OP commented on this one below and said, honestly, Jim was rather open about his sexuality. Well, in that it was something of a secret, sure, but a secret that every person knew about. At that time, in the Deep South, homosexuality was still criminalized in many areas, and honestly, police weren't exactly inclined to help a citizen who was as open as Jim was. So if a movie producer wants a car towed, and it just so happens to be the car owned by a known homosexual man, you better damn well bet the car is getting towed, whether the owner likes it or not. Also, after a little bit of looking at Wikipedia, it actually says there he didn't ask to be paid himself. He had asked for a donation to be made to the local Humane Society, but the producers declined. In the end, he came out on top. Not only did he get himself paid for being in that movie, but he got his neighbors paid as well, so that's pretty epic. Jumping over to the nuclear revenge side, our first story comes to us from Oscar the Crouch. A fitting twist. Let's jump right in. Background: I had a pretty terrible childhood. Don't get me wrong, I have heard of way worse, but it was far from healthy or normal. When I was young, my parents were millionaires, my father's parents owning several of the largest businesses in the region. They divorced before I was a teenager, and both of their lives plummeted downhill. By the time I was 16, I was living on my own. Illicit substances, alcohol, and addiction have long since killed them both. Neither of them ever worked a job since I was a teenager. Both of them died homeless before the age of 50. Situation: I joined the military and left town without ever looking back. As more years passed, I added more and more distance, physically and mentally, from my parents. When I was 20, I learned that my mother had been arrested for stealing a large sum of money from my grandmother, who was living on her own, but in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's. The state ended up pressing charges against my mother because my grandmother would not. The detective told me that they had to because my mom and her POS boyfriend were fueling the criminal underground where she lived. I was lost and shocked. I knew my mother had problems, but until this moment, I had always viewed her as a sort of forest hippie. This is the moment that is the catalyst for my nuclear revenge. You see, my grandmother was pretty wealthy. Terrified that she would be locked away in an old folks' home, she entertained the leeching of my mother and POS guy. The problem is that it was never enough. Even after my grandmother bought my mother a house down the street from her, she continued to rob her own mother blind. She also fed my underage sister a stream of illicit substances and brought her in on the con. It ultimately resulted in my mother and sister getting their first felony conviction: grand theft and check fraud, which my mother tried to pin on her own daughter because she was just a minor. A few years later, I was newly married with my first child and freshly returned from my first deployment to Iraq. We just completed another move across the country, and I'm starting a new job at a new unit. I get home from work and have a strange short voicemail from my uncle, who is like the okayest guy I have ever met. It literally just says, "My mom is in the psych ward at the big hospital in her town. She left everything in your name. I'm flying back home." This is where I learned that the legal document my grandma had me sign when I was 16 made me the executor of her estate, power of attorney, etc. My unit arranges a very generous amount of time off to fly across the country and deal with this bizarre scenario. She lived alone in this massive house. My mom had destroyed the house my grandmother bought her, then moved into grandma's house on the auspices of caring for her. There were so many fleas inside that contractors I hired to make repairs wouldn't go inside. Needles everywhere, and for some reason, everything was an ashtray. It was an insane thing to witness and experience. I still refused to interact with my mom at this point of my life, but now that I had the keys to the kingdom, aka access to the pot of gold, she tried to worm back into my life with a renewed vigor. I always just told her to F off. My grandmother, in the meantime, had been deemed unfit to live on her own. I was 23 with a new baby and marriage, if you remember, so I made the poor decision to put my grandmother into a nursing home. I fixed up the house, rented it to create passive income so she would not deplete her savings, and headed back home. Of course, Grandma is spicy and got kicked out of her swanky retirement home when she broke a coffee cup over some other lady's head for snooping around in her room. She was apparently wearing my grandmother's shoes when she got clocked. The same woman, a resident, had propositioned me in front of my wife when we were touring the facility. She was a different kind of the same spicy as Grandma. Her only option after the incident was a psych ward. So my senile grandmother moved in with my family, and she lived with us for more than 5 years until her care was just out of our capability. This is about the time that I exacted my revenge. The nuclear option. When the state filed charges against my mother way back when I was 20, part of her restitution included a lien that was placed against her property in the name of my grandmother for a little less than $100,000. Some years later, my mother had not paid her property taxes in so long that she was about to lose the house. She called me to explain that the lien would not be paid if the house was auctioned, which I knew was not true, but I saw an opportunity. I eventually worked out a deal with her. She would sign the deed over to me, and I would then sell the house and pay for her to move somewhere else. I fly to town, meet her, and sign the deed over. She expected me to use my name and credit to get her a luxury apartment. She also wanted me to buy her a new truck. And let's not forget the moving company. I rented her a U-Haul truck and got her a storage unit that I had paid for 6 months. Then I put her and Craphead up in an extended stay for a little while. I fixed up the property and sold it to the same rental group that bought my grandmother's house shortly before. I used the money to buy annuities that enable my grandmother to live in a normal house with a live-in nurse and care at 1:4 ratio, which is amazing for her. She still might run out of money because of what my mother did, and I honestly don't know what will happen then. She's got some years before I have to worry, and she is just shy of 100. My mother was on the street within 6 months. The last time I saw her, she looked like the crazy person who lives under a bridge. She did at one point. She was covered in sores, balding, and methed out. She received a Social Security disability back payment of what would have been a significant amount for her. She died in a hospital less than 3 days later, partied herself to death. The POS dropped her off at the curb and never saw her again. I told dude I would give him some money if he gave me the keys to the storage unit. Somehow, years later, she had managed to keep it. I shared the loot with my siblings, gave POS $100, and closed that chapter of my life permanently. Now, in the story, OP didn't update us on the status of their sister because they said that their sister was following in the same life path as Mother. And in the comment section, they say, well, no, she hasn't gotten any better. She's been in and out of jail her whole life, and she's currently in. OP also mentions this is probably the safest place for her to be because if she were left to her own devices on the streets, he doesn't think she would last very long. Now, you'll need to go check out the comments for this one because there is one really long comment trail going back and forth between two different Reddit users, and they're both calling each other names and really resorting to like 6th grade arguments. It's hilarious. You gotta go read it. The link is in the description down below. Check out all 3 OPs linked in the description down below. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you tomorrow.